Men carry these hidden wounds like silent soldiers, never revealing the battles raging inside their minds. And today, I'm going to expose the 6 psychological weaknesses that every man desperately tries to hide from women. Secrets that Sigmund Freud uncovered in the deepest chambers of the male psyche. The first weakness reveals itself in a moment that seems innocent, but strikes terror into every man's heart when a woman says those 4 dreaded words, "We need to talk," and watch what happens next. His entire body language shifts. He becomes defensive, changes the subject, or suddenly remembers how incredibly busy he is with something, anything that will help him escape this conversation. Picture this scenario. A man walks through the door after a stressful day at work. His partner notices the tension written across his face and asks with genuine care, "What's troubling you today?" And his automatic response, "Nothing special, just work stuff." But observe his body language closely. The crossed arms, the averted gaze, the mechanical reach for his phone tells a completely different story than his words. Freud understood that this reaction stems from a fundamental defense mechanism buried deep in every man's unconscious mind, a primitive terror of emotional exposure so powerful that it automatically activates every psychological shield the moment genuine intimacy is demanded. The roots of this weakness trace back to early childhood experiences, where Freud observed how little boys learn that emotional strength equals the suppression of feelings. Big boys don't cry become so deeply embedded in their unconscious that it operates throughout their entire lives. The child suppresses his natural emotional expression so thoroughly that the adult man has literally forgotten how to access those feelings. Here lies the cruel paradox. The more a man conceals his vulnerability, the more vulnerable he actually becomes. His partner intuitively senses this emotional distance and responds with increasing frustration. She searches for the real human being behind the mask, but he interprets her efforts as an attack on his masculinity. Freud called this projection. The man projects his own fear of weakness onto the situation and interprets loving attention as a threat deep in his unconscious. A voice whispers, "If she sees who I really am, she'll abandon me," so he strengthens his defensive walls, creating exactly the distance he was trying to prevent. The tragic irony is that women crave emotional connection. They want to know the vulnerable human being behind that strong facade, but the man interprets this longing as a weakening of his position and responds with even greater emotional withdrawal. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this creates a vicious cycle. His fear of vulnerability generates exactly the emotional gap that confirms his deepest fears. He feels misunderstood, she feels excluded, and both suffer from a problem he could solve through openness. The signal is unmistakable. When a man avoids emotional conversations, becomes physically tense, or intellectualizes the topic you're witnessing, his greatest weakness, he fears nothing more than being seen for who he really is, a human being with fears, doubts, and a profound need for unconditional acceptance. Do you recognize this pattern in your own life? This defensive behavior is only the first layer of a complex psychological structure. But the second weakness is even more subtle and dangerous. It shows itself in moments when he appears strongest and most confident. The second hidden weakness reveals itself in behavior that initially looks like strength. A man proudly tells his partner about his achievements at work, his athletic accomplishments, or his clever decisions. But watch his eyes carefully. They desperately search for her reaction, for recognition, for admiration. Imagine this scene. After a challenging day, he elaborately describes how he solved a difficult problem or impressed a colleague. His words sound confident, but his gaze waits for her validation. When she responds with, "Just that's nice, honey," and turns to other matters, his mood shifts noticeably. He becomes quieter, more irritable, or starts repeating his story. Freud would describe this behavior as narcissistic regulation, a deeply rooted need for external validation, stemming from early childhood experiences in every man's unconscious lives. The small child who yearns for maternal recognition, the partner unconsciously becomes a substitute mother whose praise determines his emotional state. This psychological dynamic is so powerful, it controls his entire behavior. He selects stories that show him in a favorable light, he exaggerates his successes, or even invents them, just to obtain that precious validation. His self-worth doesn't depend on his own assessment, but on her reaction. The paradox is striking: the stronger his need for recognition, the weaker he appears to her women. Intuitively sense this emotional neediness and often respond with withdrawal. They want a partner who is secure within himself, not a grown man who needs constant validation like a child. Freud recognized that this pattern connects to the Oedipal phase, where the little boy competes with his father for the mother's attention. This early experience shapes his later relationship behavior. He needs his partner's admiration to feel masculine and valuable. The weakness also shows in his handling of criticism. A single critical comment from his partner can occupy his mind for hours. He broods over it, justifies himself internally, and searches for ways to invalidate that criticism. His reaction is often completely disproportionate to the significance of the comment. This weakness becomes particularly evident in social situations. He tells the same success stories, repeatedly fishes for compliments, and reacts sensitively to any form of indifference. His seemingly strong ego reveals itself as a fragile construction that needs constant external nourishment. From a psychoanalytic perspective, he compensates for his deep insecurity about his own worth with this behavior. His unconscious whispers, "You're only worth as much as others value you." This conviction makes him an emotional beggar who fights endlessly for recognition. The tragic irony is that the more he courts validation, the less his partner respects him. She longs for a man confident enough not to constantly need her admiration. Have you ever noticed how a man literally lights up when you praise him, but deflates when recognition is absent? This neediness leads us directly to the third weakness, a trait he considers strength, but actually reveals his deepest insecurity. The third concealed weakness manifests in his compulsive need to control everything he plans. Every detail has a solution ready for every eventuality, and reacts with disproportionate tension when something doesn't go according to his plan. Picture this: you spontaneously suggest visiting a different restaurant than planned. His first reaction: he becomes restless, immediately lists all possible problems. No reservation, longer waiting times, unfamiliar menu. What appears to be practical thinking is actually pure fear of the unknown, of situations he cannot master. Freud would attribute this behavior to the anal phase, an early developmental stage where control equals security. These men never learned that loss of control doesn't automatically mean chaos. On the contrary, their unconscious interprets every unforeseen situation as an existential threat. The weakness reveals itself in countless everyday situations. He must drive the car because he doesn't trust others. He plans vacations down to the smallest detail and becomes nervous when you suggest changes. He obsessively controls finances and reacts irritably when you make spontaneous purchases. But the deeper psychological truth is devastating. This obsession with control doesn't spring from his strength, but from his fundamental fear of his own helplessness in his unconscious lives. The conviction, if I don't control everything, my life will collapse. Freud recognized that these men often experienced situations in childhood where they felt completely powerless. Perhaps family life was chaotic. Perhaps the parents were unpredictable. The child learned only, "When I have everything under control, am I safe?" This belief burns so deeply into the unconscious that the adult man experiences every loss of control as a repetition of that early helplessness. This weakness becomes toxic, especially in relationships. He tries to influence her decisions, predict her reactions, and control her behavior. When she acts independently or contradicts him, his unconscious interprets that as a loss of his masculinity. The irony is that the more he tries to control, the more resistance he encounters. His partner feels patronized and reacts with defiant independence. A vicious circle emerges. His control attempts intensify exactly the chaos he seeks to prevent. Psychoanalytically speaking, he projects his inner insecurity onto the external world. Instead of facing his own fears, he tries to shape his environment so these fears aren't triggered. But this never works, because the real threat doesn't come from outside, but from his own unconscious. This obsession with control also shows in his inability to accept help. He must do everything himself, decide everything himself, solve everything himself. Accepting her support would mean showing weakness, and that's unbearable for him. The tragic truth is that his supposed strength reveals itself as paralyzing weakness. He lives in a self-created prison of plans, controls, and security measures that robs him of spontaneity and joy of life. Do you recognize this compulsive need for control in your environment? This behavior is only the tip of a psychological iceberg. But the fourth weakness is even more insidious. It hides behind his apparent toughness and rationality. The fourth hidden weakness shows itself in a shocking paradox. The harder and more unfeeling a man appears outwardly, the more sensitive he is internally. His apparent emotional coldness isn't strength, but a desperate attempt to hide his own emotional vulnerability. Imagine this. You tell him about a moving film that brought you to tears. His reaction, an indifferent shrug, and the comment, "Those are just made-up stories." But watch his eyes. They reveal that he's just as moved internally, but would never admit it. Freud recognized that this emotional numbing is a powerful defense mechanism. The superego, the internalized voice of society, has whispered to him since childhood, "Real men are tough. Sensitivity is weakness. Feelings are feminine." These messages imprint so deeply into the unconscious that he literally amputates his natural emotional intelligence. The tragic truth is that men are born with the same emotional sensitivity as women, but while little girls are encouraged to express their feelings, boys systematically learn to suppress them. The result is an adult man who is emotionally stunted, not by nature, but by social conditioning. This repression shows in countless situations. He cannot cry even in deepest grief. He feels no pain when others suffer. He doesn't respond to beauty art or touching moments. His emotional world is reduced to a minimum anger, frustration, and superficial satisfaction. But Freud knew repressed feelings don't disappear. They transform. The suppressed sensitivity manifests as chronic tension, as sudden outbursts of rage without apparent reason, or as physical symptoms his body suffers under the emotional petrification. This weakness becomes particularly painful in intimate moments. When she seeks emotional closeness, she encounters a wall of indifference, his inability to show feelings she interprets as withdrawal of love. But in truth, he longs just as much for emotional connection. He's simply forgotten how to access it. The psychoanalytic explanation is heartbreaking. His inner child still lives within him, full of tenderness and sensitivity. But the tyrannical superego has banished this child to the deepest basement of his unconscious. There it screams silently for liberation while he outwardly plays the strong man. This emotional petrification becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fewer feelings he shows, the less emotional resonance he receives from his environment. His partner withdraws, his children seek comfort from their mother. He actually becomes the emotionally cold person he pretends to be. Freud called this reaction formation, the development of behaviors that represent the exact opposite of repressed impulses. His toughness isn't an expression of strength, but protection from his own fragility. The irony is that women long for emotional authenticity. They want to know the vulnerable, feeling human being behind the mask. but he interprets this longing as an attack on his masculinity and strengthens his emotional armor. Have you ever experienced a moment when his mask fell for an instant and you saw the sensitive person behind it? This emotional petrification leads us to the fifth weakness, a mechanism that's even more destructive and can poison your relationship. The fifth and perhaps most dangerous weakness reveals itself in a devious psychological trick. He makes you responsible for his own problems when he's insecure. You're too critical when he feels unloved. You're too distant when he fails. You're too demanding. Picture this after a difficult day at work. He comes home irritated. Instead of admitting he's overwhelmed, he attacks you. You always make such a face when I come home. Can't you be friendly for once? His own bad mood becomes your problem. His dissatisfaction becomes your fault. Freud called this mechanism projection, one of the most powerful defense mechanisms of the unconscious. What he cannot accept about himself, he projects onto you. His own repressed weaknesses, fears, and inadequacies are reinterpreted as your characteristics. The psychological dynamic is insidious. His unconscious cannot bear that he is imperfect, that would destroy his fragile self-image, so it automatically searches for a scapegoat and finds it in the person closest to him. You become the projection screen for his repressed self-doubts. This weakness becomes particularly insidious because it seems so convincing. He actually believes that you are the problem. His indignation is genuine. His accusations sound justified. He has deceived himself so successfully that he takes his own projections for truth. The patterns are always the same. When he feels unattractive, he accuses you of no longer desiring him. When he's professionally dissatisfied, he blames you for not supporting him enough. When he doubts his abilities, he claims you constantly criticize him. His inner conflicts are reinterpreted as relationship problems. Freud recognized that this projection becomes especially strong when he feels threatened. The more insecure he feels, the more aggressive his accusations become. Your success becomes his threat. Your independence becomes his failure. Your strength becomes his weakness. The tragic irony is that by projecting his problems onto you, he creates exactly the relationship dynamic he unconsciously fears. You actually become more critical because you constantly have to justify yourself. You become more distant because his accusations are hurtful. His projections become self-fulfilling prophecies. Psychoanalytically speaking, this projection is a survival mechanism of his ego. If he were to acknowledge his true weaknesses, he would have to rethink his entire self-image. That's unbearable for his unconscious. He'd rather make you responsible for his inner conflicts. Particularly perfidious is how he twists reality until you doubt your own perception. You're just imagining that you're too sensitive. You make a drama out of everything. These sentences are weapons in his unconscious war against his own inadequacy. The consequences are devastating. You lose trust in your own perception. You actually take responsibility for his problems. You begin to wonder if you're really as difficult as he claims. Do you recognize this pattern? These blame assignments aren't your truth. They're his escape from his own. But the sixth and final weakness is perhaps the most subtle of all. It disguises itself as intelligence and objectivity. The sixth and most sophisticated weakness shows itself in his attempt to destroy every emotional truth with logic. When you express a feeling, he responds with facts. When you have an intuition, he explains why that's irrational. His weapon against emotional intimacy, the cold, seemingly superior power of reason. Imagine this: you intuitively sense that something isn't right in your relationship and share this feeling with him. His immediate reaction: he analyzes your statement, dissects it logically, and systematically explains why your perception is wrong. That's completely illogical. He says, "Where's the evidence? Those are just emotions, not facts." Freud would call this behavior intellectualization, one of the most subtle defense mechanisms. By rationalizing everything, he protects himself from the threatening world of feelings. His mind becomes a fortress that shields his vulnerable soul from emotional truth. The psychological reality is devastating. This apparent intellectual superiority doesn't spring from his strength, but from his fear. Deep in his unconscious, he knows that feelings transport a truth that threatens his rational control, so he systematically discredits everything emotional as inferior and irrational. This weakness shows in countless situations. You express concerns about his behavior. He refutes them with arguments. You feel neglected. He proves the opposite. With his calendar, you long for more romance. He explains that those are unrealistic expectations. Freud recognized that these men often learned in childhood that emotional expressions are dangerous. Perhaps their feelings were ignored or ridiculed. The child learned only with my mind. Am I safe? Feelings lead to pain. This conviction burns so deeply into the unconscious that the adult man perceives every emotional reality as a threat. The irony is that the more he rationalizes, the more illogical he actually becomes. His arguments become justifications. His logic becomes manipulation. He twists reality until it fits his rational worldview. Contradictions are ignored, inconvenient truths explained away. This weakness becomes particularly perfidious when he systematically undermines your emotional intelligence. You think too much with your heart. You see problems where none exist. You're too emotional to judge this objectively. With such sentences, he makes you the irrational hysteric and himself the reasonable realist. Psychoanalytically speaking, this rationalization is an escape mechanism from his own emotional truth. If he allowed feelings to be as valid as thoughts, he would have to face his repressed emotions. That's unbearable for his unconscious. The tragic consequence is that he loses access to his own emotional wisdom. His intuition atrophies, his empathy dies. He becomes an emotional robot that functions perfectly but no longer truly lives. This rationalization becomes a wall between him and genuine intimacy. You can reach him with facts, but never with your soul. His fortress of logic becomes a prison for both of you. Do you recognize this mechanism? This apparent superiority is actually his greatest weakness, the inability to accept emotional truths. These 6 weaknesses reveal the true secret of male psychology, a complex system of fears hidden behind the mask of strength. Freud's insights are timeless because they unveil the unconscious, that hidden world that controls our behavior without us noticing. The crucial question is, which of these weaknesses have you already recognized? And even more important, what hidden truth about yourself might you discover if you honestly look into the mirror of your own relationships? Drop a comment below, telling me which country you're watching from. I'm curious about our international community, and if this video has changed your understanding of male psychology, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to recognize and understand these patterns.